All right. Well, welcome everyone to Jilting the Straw Man, taking a look at the flip-flop essay. Let's pray and then we will jump right in. Lord, thank you so much for another beautiful day. We thank you for your goodness and your faithfulness to us. We ask for your wisdom and guidance as we take a look at this tricky assignment, the flip-flop essay. And Lord, we love you. It's in your name. Amen. So like I said, the flip-flop essay is actually a tricky assignment. It's not necessarily that the content itself is hard, but the concept of the paper is hard. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will be walking through Canvas and the Canvas instructions and looking at some samples and stuff like that along the way. So in order to understand the flip-flop essay, you need to realize that it's a combined assignment that helps you build toward your final argumentative essay. So both of these essays are argumentative in nature. They're persuasive. Now, whenever we're trying to persuade somebody of something, it means that we're taking a look at somebody who doesn't agree with us, and we're trying to convince them to come over to our side, to come at least closer to our own views. Hello, Sharina. Welcome. We just got started taking a look at the flip-flop essay. My name is Mariah. Great to have you here tonight. How's it going?
Everything's going well. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing wonderfully. Like I said, it's wonderful to have you joining us.
Thank
So
you.
as we're thinking about the flip-flop essay, what I was just saying is that it's important to look at it in combination with the final argumentative essay. And you'll notice that because these essays are the same kind of thing, they're both persuasive essays. In both cases, we're looking at an audience that doesn't agree with us. We're not like preaching to the choir here. We're saying, you don't agree with me, and I'm asking you to come over to my side. So we're starting off over here with the flip-flop essay. And frankly, whenever you think about the flip-flop essay, I start to get confused. So for me, it's actually easier if I start with understanding the final argumentative essay and then work backwards to the flip-flop essay. So I'm going to change my screen over here. This assignment description is in week 7, the final argumentative essay for LEN 101. Now, this final argumentative essay is an 8 to 10 page paper where you're articulating your current viewpoint on a topic. Whenever I'm teaching this class, I usually say some kind of debatable topic, something that's controversial. Usually it's going to be some sort of culturally relevant issue. Popular topics in my classes in the past have been things like abortion, gun control, border control, things like that. And then there have been some very niche topics that people have dived into as well. And so for this final essay, you're going to argue what you really believe, which is great. You're like, okay, I think I can get that. So I'm going to write 8 to 10 pages on what I really believe about this issue. So if I was, for example, writing about abortion, what I might argue in this final paper is I'm going to argue that the United States should outlaw abortion across the United States without exceptions. That's a position I might consider arguing. And then I'll spend those 8 to 10 pages talking about that, include biblical support. Now, inside this essay, this final essay, you have to do something called include counter arguments. Some other words that might be used are some refutations, some rebuttals. If you look down here in the rubric, you'll notice that it's called opposing arguments. And this is where we start to move toward the idea of the flip-flop essay. Whenever you're writing an argument, it's helpful to say, you know what? Because I'm trying to convince somebody who doesn't agree with me. Let me get inside their head a little bit. What's an argument that they might make that I can address ahead of time? Now, doing this actually does a few things. First of all, anytime we get outside of our own head and we try to place ourselves in somebody else's perspective, it actually allows us to see the issue more clearly. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to completely change our position or anything, but it might help us just to see things a little bit differently. Of course, something else that we're looking to do is we're looking for weak arguments in our position, or perhaps just areas that make you think twice. So for example, with the abortion debate, some arguments that people tend to have a little bit more trouble addressing are cases of rape and incest, or whenever the mom really is just having trouble and financially can't afford to take care of a child. And so those are some real concerns where people are like, hey, I don't want the mom to have to go through trauma, or this mom really can't afford to care for another baby. Those are real issues. It's not just like they're not making it up. And so I want to address those concerns. And whenever I take the time to address those concerns, first of all, I strengthen my own argument. The other thing that I do is I provide the person who's listening with an opportunity for them to see that I've considered their position. Because whether I write about it or not, those objections are going to pop up inside their head. And if I don't address them, then my argument is weaker. Because they're just going to say, oh, well, they didn't include any opposition to my argument, so they must not have an answer. But if I acknowledge it and at least provide a response, they may not agree with the response, but it'll make them a lot more open to considering my position, because I've walked through what their counter argument is and provided my own refutation, saying, hey, this is how I would address that counter argument. Now, that's for the final paper. We want to make sure we include our strongest arguments. We want to include the other side's arguments, and we want to sort of say, hey, this is how I would address those other arguments. How are we tracking so far? Everybody good? Super. So that's the final. Now we're not here to talk about the final. We're here to look at the flip-flop essay. So let's come on over here back to the flip-flop. What the flip-flop essay is you sort of have to have a little bit of an out-of-body experience. I like to tell my students, hey, you know what? If you're really struggling with this, you can just give yourself an alternate identity. Put a different name at the top of your paper. Because what you're doing in this essay is you're actually writing those counter arguments for that final paper as if they were your own. Now, this is well, again, a little bit mind-boggling. So if I was doing abortion, and if you do abortion for the final, then you have to keep it for the flip-flop. So whatever topic you pick for the flip-flop, you're going to write about it for the final argumentative essay as well. So if I'm doing abortion, then in this essay, the flip-flop essay, I need to argue a position that I do not have. Now, generally speaking, you're going to be doing pretty much the exact opposite. However, we always want to encourage that there's nuanced perspectives. And so sometimes your final argument may not be exactly 180 from what you argued in the first one, but just to make it easy, let's say for, again, abortion, I may argue, okay, I am going to assume the position that abortion should be legalized across the United States, and there should be no restrictions whatsoever, no time restrictions, nothing, any case, any reason, anything. Now, that is not the position that I hold. However, for this essay, I'm going to assume the position of somebody. I'm going to take on the identity of somebody who does believe that. Now, this is where the title of our workshop really comes into play, Jilting the Straw Man. A straw man is a logical fallacy, so a straw man fallacy, in which you set up an argument of your opposition that's really easy to knock down. And you say, oh, well, okay, well, the other side says this really stupid thing over here, but that's really easy to knock down. And sometimes whenever we create the flip-flop essay, the tendency can be to say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and find the bumper sticker slogans or the things that my opposition says that are like things you see on social media that are really easy to address and to knock down. And that can be tempting. Let me tell you, that can be tempting. And certainly if one of their major arguments is something that's easy to knock down, should be included in this essay. Absolutely. However, what I like to make a case for instead is sort of like building up the Iron Man version of the argument. It's actually called steel manning, but we can all think of Iron Man, the superhero, right? And how he's so strong. And if you can take down Iron Man, that's a pretty strong case that your argument is solid. And so I encourage people whenever they're trying to write the flip-flop essay to do research and to say, okay, what is the strongest argument that the other person has, that the other side has? What are their strongest arguments? And you're going to write about those first. So if I was doing, again, let's say abortion, what I might do is I might come to the library's homepage. So I'm going to go to LBC's library page. And I'm going to go to the research guide for our class. And why am I doing research? Well, because I don't believe that abortion should be legalized across the United States with no restrictions. And so I don't know if, I've heard some of the bumper sticker slogans, but I don't know what the other side's best and most popular arguments are. So I want to do some research to be able to figure that out. Clicking on the wrong button out of habit. So we're going to come down to literature and language. And I'm going to click on the research guide for English Comp LEN 101. And then I'm going to come into databases and tutorials. And this is a really helpful page to bookmark for this class, particularly for the flip-flop and the final argumentative essays. Now, these first three databases here, Gale and Context, Credo Pro Con, and Issues and Controversies, are really excellent starter databases for you to sort of figure out, okay, I don't really know how to direct my research. I don't know what the other side's best arguments are. And so I'll just take a brief look into all three because each one looks slightly different and presents the information in a slightly different way. And depending on the topic you pick, so we're going to find something on abortion in all three of these because abortion is a very popular topic. If you have a topic that is a little bit more niche, for example, I had a student a couple of semesters ago who did the body positivity movement, and he did not find something in every single database, so he had to look around a little bit. But so this is, again, Gale in Context. And you can certainly use the search bar over here. I like to just go ahead and browse issues. And it'll be here alphabetically. And so I'm going to come over here to the side and see if I have anything. I thought that they had abortion as an issue, but apparently not. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and have to search over here. Okay. Now, you'll notice whenever this pops up, that it starts off with academic journals. If you are looking at the final argumentative essay and the flip-flop essay requirements, remember that you have source requirements that you're working toward. So in this database, academic journals satisfies the criteria for an academic peer-reviewed journal article. And so if you're having trouble finding this kind of source, this is one of the places you can look to find something. However, the articles are usually a lot more narrow in scope, and so I'm going to skip those for now and instead just highlight these viewpoints over here. So the viewpoints in this database are essentially editorial. So they're position papers that people have submitted their essays. They are not scholarly journal articles, so they don't satisfy that criteria, but they're still good sources that can be used to help you get a picture of what are some popular arguments for the other side. So results in more women dying. This is probably one of the most popular ones that I see. These first two are essentially the same. And notice we have these primary sources as well. So that's really interesting. So that's in Gale in Context, and some of the other topics are going to be display a little bit differently. So if you look at like the topic finder, and I do search. Notice what it's done here is it's given me some additional items to search. or different sort of search terms to categorize it with. So instead of just searching abortion, I might specifically talk about abortion pills. Because Roe v. Wade was overturned, there's been a lot of more discussion about abortion pills. And so that actually might help me to narrow my topic down, for example. So this is a little bit in context. Let's pop over here to Credo reference. Now notice that Credo reference as a whole is a dictionary encyclopedia database. And so if you are on the library's homepage in the LAN 101 database and tutorials portion of the research guide, if you just click on Credo reference or do a search in Credo reference, it will not take you to this. You have to click on the pro con in order to get to this page. Notice we do have abortion as a topic, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And what I like about Credo reference is that it starts off with a nice background of the topic. It'll describe the two groups who are primarily involved, sort of describing the different major sides. Background, history, regulation, etc. Some stats. And then this is my favorite part of this database and these types of articles. We have the top pro and con arguments for this particular topic. And so for me, again, thinking if I am assuming the role of somebody who believes that abortion should be legalized across the United States without any restrictions, I'm going to pretend to be that person. What are my top arguments going to be? This is a helpful guide to get me started, where I say, okay, well, this was Roe v. Wade. Now, this is outdated because it was the last updated on the 2016. Whew, words are hard. In 2016, and since then we have had Roe v. Wade overturned. And so somebody certainly still could argue that abortion had for almost 50 years legalized abortion through the Supreme Court, legalized. But that was overturned in Jackson v. Dobbs. And so that's a counter argument that you could offer later, regardless. So that's an argument that you can make. Reproductive choice empowers women by giving them control over their own bodies. Now, I'm pretending to be a student who hasn't done research on this topic. Because I am actually somebody who has done a lot of research in this area, I happen to know that this is perhaps the top argument that I see for people who are arguing for abortion. My sample essay that I have over here is actually, it's not a sample flip-flop essay. Whenever I used to teach at community college, I got permission from a student to use her essay as an actual essay. And this is an actual essay arguing for abortion from the position of somebody who really believes that abortion should be legalized. And that's her first argument, that women should have control over their reproductive choices. And in her essay, she talks about bodily autonomy, and that's one of her main arguments. And that's been consistent, I found, in abortion arguments, is that a bodily autonomy is a major argument. And so again, as we're thinking about, okay, I'm taking notes, what are some major things that I might want to argue if I'm pretending to be the person who believes that abortion should be legalized? This is an argument that I would argue. Personhood begins after a fetus becomes viable, another common argument, and on. And so again, you can see that this is a helpful guide. And if your topic is here, then it's super, super helpful. The last one I'm going to show you, last database, is in issues and controversies. Notice on the side here that again, we have some pro-con specific articles. Not every topic is covered in a pro-con article, but the ones that are very, very helpful. Wait for it to load. Six years later, we'll have Christmas, Easter, Christmas, Easter. While it's loading, and again, the nice thing about these articles is not that we're going to use them for all of our research, but it's going to give us a really good direction for our research. It's going to give us our main talking points that are going to become the supporting points, the paragraphs that we develop in our essay. We can certainly use these articles for some of our research, but we're going to do additional research outside of that as well. And issues and controversies with this pro-con article starts off right away with the supporters and then opponents, which again is just really nice. It's a nice summary of the information, some background information, and on. And so these articles can be really, really, again, just helpful to get your feet grounded, to say, okay, what am I actually going to argue in this essay? And so if I was jotting down notes and saying, okay, so I have my page all set up with MLA formatting. Let's say that I wanted to give myself an alternate identity because I'm like, I just can't write this paper as if it was me. I need to pretend. I need to give myself an alternate identity for this class. Okay. So let's say I'm talking about, my topic is abortion. And I am arguing for abortion for the flip-flop. And I actually do like to fully write these things out whenever I'm doing this, because otherwise I get confused, because this is a very confusing assignment. So arguing for abortion for the flip-flop. So abortion should be legalized United States with no restrictions. So this is my thesis claim. And now I have my subclaims or supports. Depending on what your professor calls them, there may be some different names. So typically, your professor will ask for 3 supporting reasons or 3 subclaims to support your claim that you're making in your thesis. And so I'm going to say because, and I'm going to go ahead and actually just list these out as bullets to start, just to make it easier to track. And I may say something like, it supports bodily autonomy. Fetuses are not people. And then the one that I actually tend to see argued most often, other than these other 2, are that women who have undergone rape, incest, oh my gosh, incest should not. Okay, essentially, shouldn't have to go through the trauma. And so if I put this all together, my thesis statement draft would be something along the lines of, abortion should be legalized across the United States because with no restrictions, because abortion supports bodily autonomy. Fetuses are not people with rights, and women who have undergone rape should not have to go through trauma. Okay. And this right here, this thesis statement draft, will become then the overarching guide for my paper. This is going to be the marching band director for my entire paper. So if I'm using this to create an outline, so obviously we'll always have an introduction. And then these 3 points will become my major body paragraphs. Oops. Wrong button. And I could even change these colors to make it even more fun and easy to follow. We're gonna get a headache because of all the colors. It's okay. I should change the color first and then copy it. That would be smart. That would be smart. Here, let's see if we can get it this time. Okay, there we go. Close. And this is the basic starting place of organization for my paper. And then for each one of these, as we make these paragraphs, we want to have evidence underneath each one. And as you're talking about evidence in class, you're going to see, of course, that there are different kinds of evidence, that you can have personal testimonies, you can have statistics, you can have news stories, you can have all sorts of things, logical constructions, all sorts of ways that you can incorporate evidence into your essay. But even in this flip-flop essay, whenever you are arguing the position that does not belong to you, you still want to make sure that you have evidence. Why? Because we're jilting the straw man. We're rejecting the straw man argument, and we want to build the strong argument. So to make the argument strong, we do need to make sure that we incorporate evidence for each point. Any questions so far? This is really just my opportunity to take a sip of water. Okay, let's keep rolling. Now, the part that gets even more confusing with the flip-flop essay, if I pop on over here, is that you have to include in the flip-flop essay an opposing argument. And so you're like, and I think is it on this page? It might not be on this page that it includes the instruction, but you have to include an opposing argument, a counter argument for your flip-flop essay. And so if we jump back over, that means that remember, the counter argument is you're looking at what the other person, the audience, believes. And so I'm actually going to come back up here to the top, and I'm going to add in my audience. So remember, for this paper, I'm arguing for abortion, which means that because it's a persuasive essay, my audience does not agree with me. And so if I'm painting a picture of who my audience might be, oftentimes the easiest audience for me to paint a picture of whenever you're thinking about the flip-flop essay is actually yourself. And so I'm going to say, I'm thinking Christian women. I'm going to say college student just to make it easier. Student who is pro-life. And so this is who I'm addressing in the flip-flop essay. And so all of these arguments are things that I'm talking about to somebody who believes in the pro-life position. And so whenever I am then creating a counter argument, what I'll want to do is say, okay, I need to include an argument for the other side. Who is the other side? The other side is my audience, who actually happens to be me, which means that essentially you're writing a paragraph for your final argumentative essay here. And you're saying, hey, this is something I'm actually going to argue later, but I'm going to include it as a counter argument here. So this is where things really get crazy. They really get crazy. So I'm going to write in counter argument and then refutation. Because again, this is where things get tricky. So remember, counter argument is for pro-life. And then the refutation is back to pro-abortion. Okay. So, because this is my position, I might choose to say, okay, well, I'm going to, in my counter argument, respond to one of the arguments that were made over here. I might choose to address the claim that women who have undergone rape or incest shouldn't have to go through trauma. One common response that I've seen people give is that, no, sorry, hopefully she'll be back. One common response that I've seen people give is that it's true that it might be hard to give birth to an unwanted child of rape or incest. However, and then there's usually two arguments that they include. It will be more traumatic to kill the baby. And it is not just to inflict punishment on another innocent life. And those are usually the two most common responses. We'll add for the woman. Those are usually the most two common responses that I see to this particular argument. And so remember, the counter argument is you're not changing sides, you're just presenting the other side. And so as I'm framing the counter argument, I'm not just going to say, it's true that it might be hard, however. Instead, I'm going to say something like, some may disagree. For example, pro-life Christians will argue that and I'm going to frame it as some people say, even though this is what I really believe, this is my real position. Remember that for this essay, I am assuming the role of somebody who doesn't believe the same things that I do. And so I need to keep that throughout the entire thing so that it doesn't seem like I have multiple personality disorder. And so it's important to keep this language that some may agree. So some people will argue over here. Therefore, these Christians conclude that abortion should not be legalized. Now, this is where I think students really go off the rails and they say, I don't, wait, because then you can't just leave the counter argument standing. Now, this is much easier to do in your final argumentative essay, whenever you are arguing for your own perspective, whenever you're arguing for what you really think. Because then you bring in the other side's perspective and you're like, oh yeah, but I don't want to leave that standing. I want to knock it down. I want to refute that argument. However, whenever you're in the flip-flop, you're like, well, I kind of want to leave that argument there because that's what I really think. However, remember, for this essay, you're presenting the position that is not your own. You are pretending like you are someone else. And so you do need to still knock down that other argument. This is a hard argument to come back from. So I don't really know what people say. So however, though it might be true that it is not just is still the case that, and I'm going to actually refer to one of the arguments that we decided to use earlier, that fetuses are not people with rights. Therefore, they are not really victims. And abortion should still be legalized. And so that is, again, hard to work your mind around, I think, because you're assuming the role of somebody else. However, again, what does this help you to do? Why do we bother going through and doing this entire flip-flop essay? Well, again, we have a couple of reasons for this. But first of all, it does help us to explore those. Hello, welcome. It does help us to explore those other positions. And so I may never have thought about how somebody who has gone through rape or incest, that's a really traumatizing situation. And so I don't want to get so locked in on the rights of an unborn child that I forget about the innocent woman who is also suffering. And so as I'm crafting that final argumentative essay, maybe originally before I wrote this flip-flop essay, I might have had a really harsh position and just said, well, you just need to find a straw and suck it up. And that's not a very gracious response to somebody who's suffering. And so writing the flip-flop essay gives us that opportunity to get inside the heads of somebody with whom we would disagree and to try to really genuinely see what do they really believe, and to, as again, with as little, not that we're trying to change our minds, but that we're really trying to explore what are their best arguments, why do they think that, are there any good things about that argument, how do I respond to it in the way that makes my argument strongest. And again, in this case, specifically thinking about in cases of rape and incest, hopefully that'll make my argument more compassionate. And the responses that I give will be a more compassionate response rather than, I have my baseball bat of truth and I'm just going to smash you over the head with it. Because frankly, although it might be true, it's not persuasive. And part of what we're learning to do is to be able to take truth and deliver it with grace. Not just because that's persuasive, but also because that's what Christ calls us to. He calls us to treat people as individuals, to treat people with compassion, and to treat them as humans. And so that, again, that's part of what the flip-flop essay does for us, is it gives us the opportunity to really look at the other person's positions as them, which is why sometimes I actually, like I said, I actually change the name at the top of my essay to somebody's name that's not mine. And I'm going to say, hey, I'm really going to just completely step out of myself. And I'm going to assume the role of somebody who believes the opposite of what I believe. And I'm going to pretend like I'm writing to myself. Now, the other thing that the flip-flop essay does, besides all of the really good principle stuff and all the philosophical stuff with helping us get inside the mindset of somebody else, is it does actually help to prepare us for that final argumentative essay. So if we go back over, remember we already took a look at the final argumentative essay, because remember the flip-flop and the argumentative essay are two parts of a single piece. They're not separate assignments. For the flip-flop essay, you argue the opposite of what you believe, and then for the final, you argue what you do believe about that same topic. And so if you're thinking strategically here for your final argumentative essay, and we're thinking about what you need to include. So you need to include your thesis statement, which is going to have several supporting points, those several subclaims or supporting ideas that are going to become your body paragraphs where you develop your ideas. We have already done potentially one big idea over here in our outline, but we included it as a counter argument. Remember, your counter argument for your flip-flop is an argument for your real side. And so I could, in my final argumentative essay, reuse this paragraph. Now, I'm not going to phrase it exactly the same, but I might say one of my arguments for the pro-life side is that abortion actually causes more harm to women than simply giving a baby up for adoption or keeping a child would be. And I could use this as an example. Now, of course, What I don't have here is evidence. And so I, of course, would want to include evidence to help to back that up. However, so you could reuse that. So your counter argument for your flip-flop can become one section of your arguments for your final argumentative essay. Anybody have any questions on that point? Okay, let's keep rolling. So that's your counter argument. Remember, the counter argument for the flip-flop can become a real argument for your final argumentative essay. However, most of this essay is going to be arguments for the other side. We have, in fact, three major sections, three arguments that are for the other side. Now, for your final argumentative essay, you do need to include counter arguments. And again, counter arguments or opposing arguments, that's the same thing. And for that final argumentative essay, you have to have a minimum of 2 counter arguments. So your arguments, your main ideas for your flip-flop can become counter arguments for that final argumentative essay. And so if you're strategic with how you build things, you can have a large chunk of that final argumentative essay written even before you get there. So the flip-flop essay is, of course, much shorter than your final argumentative essay. However, it gives you a starting place. And so not only are you, again, sort of thinking about your argument in a really critical fashion, you're opening yourself up for critique. You're saying, okay, what's the weakest position of my argument? And you're using the flip-flop essay to do that, but you're also essentially starting your rough draft of the final argumentative essay. You can reuse a lot of the ground in that final essay, which is really helpful. Now, of course, what you're going to have to do even more of is you're going to have to write your actual arguments. You're going to have to develop additional ideas and develop them. You might need a background or a context paragraph after your introduction. You'll probably need to change your introduction because what you wrote for your starting paragraph for your flip-flop essay isn't really going to work for your final argumentative essay. But a lot of the material you should be able to reuse. A lot of the sources you should be able to reuse. So let's recap just briefly where we've been. So we talked about how the final argumentative essay is actually sometimes a better place to start, to say, hey, what issue, what topic do I want to argue for? What do I want to make a positive case for? And then say, okay, now for the flip-flop, I have to argue the opposite of that. So then we go over to the flip-flop and say, okay, I'm going to figure out what I'm going to use as the opposite argument. And then we talked about how to use the LAN 101 research guide. And on the research guide page, we then went over to the databases and tutorials section, and we took a look at these 3 starter databases. And I think for this particular topic, Credo Pro Con and Issues and Controversies were especially helpful. Remember that what's helpful here is they have the top pro and con arguments in Credo reference. And then over here in Issues and Controversies, we have the supporters argue and then the opponents argue sections. And so as we're trying to say, okay, I don't want to just build a straw man, I want to steel man the argument. I want to build an Iron Man of their argument, the strongest argument possible for the other side, so that I can make my argument even stronger by knocking down their best arguments. These are good places to start our research so that we're not just looking up bumper sticker slogans and things that people say on social media. Now, as we mentioned before, sometimes people repeat things on social media because it is actually what people really think, like it is their best arguments. And so just because you've seen something on social media doesn't mean that it's not one of the best or most popular arguments. Just be careful to use good sources to help you shape what your position is going to be for both essays. You don't want to just use bumper sticker slogans in general. for creating your arguments. So we use the issues and controversies in Credo to help us formulate our thesis, claim, and our subclaims or supports or supporting reasons. And then we combined those things together into our thesis statement draft, one big, beautiful statement. And then we use the thesis statement draft to help us build a basic outline for the flip-flop essay. We had our intro, our 3 main points. And then we talked about moving into the counter argument or opposing argument and the refutation. And remember, we talked about how it's hard whenever you're writing the flip-flop essay. I think this is actually the hardest part, is saying, okay, I'm not changing perspectives here. I'm just saying, hey, there are some people, I am that person, but not for this essay. There are some people who argue something else. What do these other people argue? To present that as what they say. And then this is the hardest thing. You can't just let that argument stand. You do have to address it because you're assuming the role of that other person. So we talked about refuting, knocking down, I like to say, you get kick, drop it in the face, the argument of the other side. And of course, landing the plane with a conclusion. And that's the basic structure of the flip-flop essay. And then we talked again about then reusing a lot of this material you can reuse toward your final argumentative essay. Does anybody have any questions or anything that you want us to review in more detail? Okay. As you're working on this assignment, I believe the rough draft is due. Is it due this week for this class? And then the final draft will be due next week. It is helpful to, if you can, get that draft in early, because then your professor can give you some really good feedback as you're looking through to the next step, which is not just turning in your final draft, but also starting to work on that final argumentative essay. As you move forward, of course, you can always schedule an individual appointment with anybody from the Ally Center. I usually have hours Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but we have hours all across the board. We do have additional workshops coming up as well. So we are still in September. I know some of you are already signed up for Communicating Effectively, which is the next workshop that I will be running. We're going to be looking at the principles of tap and tone. So topic, audience, purpose, and tone. So the things we talked about today, some of that will directly apply for this workshop as well. And of course, you can sign up for any of the rest of our workshops that we have. We've got a lot of stuff going on in October, so lots of good things coming up ahead. Anything, of course, that you need the Ally Center for, we are more than happy to assist you. So thank you, everybody, for coming today.